everyone, and welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
So this is Terrascope's third Climate Cafe, and I think this is the last one I'll number, so we'll just be the Terrascope Climate Cafe. We're getting enough under our belt, which is exciting. Definitely a special one because you're the first man I've had as a Climate Cafe host, kind of guest. So we've had 3 women so far, so very excited. Bit of gender diversity. Also, the first kind of industry focus. So this one, the theme today is around forests and land. So this is an area that overlaps well with our focus on food and agricultural value chain as Terrascope. So very exciting for that. And a partner. So CDP is a great partner of Terrascope, an organization we work closely with. And we as Terrascope are a CDP Gold accredited software provider. So very excited to be kind of chatting and collaborating on a number of fronts. So to introduce our guest today, Thomas Maddox. Tom is the Global Director of Forests and Land at CDP. So forest and land, we will unpack that a little bit. And you've got over 20 years of experience working for different environmental organizations, a really amazing career, starting off with a kind of environmental focus, doing a PhD in ecology, and eventually doing a master's in business. So a very interesting transition. You've worked at a number of environmental organizations, Flora and Fauna International, kind of WWF, and now with CDP. And you spent 10 years in Indonesia, which we've been chatting about, looking at tigers. So very exciting work, and also working closely on palm oil, forestry, and mining sectors. So really, really great and interesting background. So I'd love to just kind of start with hearing a little more about your professional journey and kind of what inspired you, especially that shift from ecology into business. Where did that come in your career, and how has it led you to your position in CDP today? Sure.
Okay. Well, so as you said, I started out as an ecologist. No sort of plan to the career or anything like that. I loved studying, watching, being with animals. If someone was going to pay me to do that, that was fantastic. So I started off by doing sort of volunteer projects. Then I was lucky enough to get a PhD. So that involved spending time in Africa working on cheetahs, big cats, various things. My first job was a research job, which was basically looking at tigers in Sumatra. And there was a bunch of tigers living on an oil palm plantation. And the plantation managers had an issue that they were meant to be managing the site for palm oil, but they also had tigers and a protected species, and they were basically asking, well, what should we be doing? What's the right thing to do here? And so we set up a research. I worked at that time for the Zoological Society of London, which is London Zoo. Mm-hmm. And the aim of the research was, well, how are tigers living here? Where are they living? What can the plantation do to avoid, to produce their palm oil, but to avoid the impacts on the tigers? So that was the initial focus. But that's where the interest in business came from, because this was early 2000s. This was when the palm oil issues started sort of bubbling up, and you started to get the first campaigns from Greenpeace and so on. And you had this really polarized debate with the environmental NGOs on one side saying palm oil is this terrible, evil thing. But on the other side, palm oil was doing, economically, it's doing amazing things for places like Indonesia. And I was sort of stuck right in the middle of it. And you could see that the decisions the company was making were absolutely key. They were key locally, but they're also key in what was happening in sort of policy making and so on. And so I kind of thought this is the place to be to drive change. So that program expanded into a whole program that was looking at environmental issues on sort of industrial landscapes, and we worked with more palm oil companies. We started working with mining companies, oil and gas companies, and basically because no one was really looking outside protected areas about what was going on, and that ended up being the focus of that whole sort of research program. But then I kind of realised that being an expert in cheetahs, working with companies was not very useful, so that's why I went back to school and got the business degree, and have focused on this sort of interface between business and environment ever since.
Great stuff. And so tell us a little bit about CDP. What does CDP do, and how did you come to join the organization?
Okay, so CDP is another environmental NGO. I've always worked for environmental NGOs, but it's quite different from the other ones. So the theory of change of CDP, it's all focused on the power of disclosure. So it's about sort of shining a light on, it's predominantly companies, but not only, shining a light on an organisation and showing where are they in their environmental journey. And just that sort of action opens the door to lots of change. So that's basically the theory of it. It's shine that spotlight on organisations, where are they in their journey, and then, if necessary, either work with others or do it ourselves to actually drive improvements in that. So the way we do that is, the whole thing started out 20 years ago. It's not a very old company or very old organisation. It started out 20 years ago with the founders sort of recognising that there were investors making decisions on companies that they were going to invest in, and they had no idea what their climate performance was like because there was nothing to tell you. So they started out with a very simple questionnaire. They got the investors to send a letter saying, please fill in this questionnaire. The company sent it back. The investors could then make decisions based on the results. That grew from, I think they had something like 30 companies to begin with, and it's been growing at 30 to 40% per year. Now we have close to 20,000 entities, so it's about 18,000 companies. We've got 1,000 cities, states and regions disclosing through us, about 500 financial institutions disclosing through us. So every year they fill in a questionnaire. It could be a questionnaire on what your climate performance is, or what your deforestation performance is, or what your water security performance is. Fill in the questionnaire. We then give a grade on how transparent and how they're performing, and then that information sort of feeds back into the market, and investors and other decision makers should make decisions based on that information.
Right. And when did CDP CDP started climate disclosure, now became CDP and added forest. So when did that kind of
So CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. Okay. So it used to be fully climate focused. About 10 years in, they brought in the water questionnaire, I think was first, and then about a year later they brought in the forest questionnaire as well. So we got these three separate but overlapping questionnaires, each assessing how are you doing on these sort of three environmental issues.
And companies can pick which one that they want.
Sort of. Well, it is all voluntary, so yes. We target companies. So for forests, we have a sort of matrix that looks at all the companies out there, and then it ranks them who according to what we think their probable impacts on forests are, who are the top ones we want disclosing. CDP hasn't got the capacity to ask everybody we want, so we have to give a sort of certain sample. These will be our top companies we want to ask, and then the sort of machinery goes out to send out the letters to those and to have the investors and others pushing disclosure from those companies. So it is targeted. We do get companies we haven't asked to disclose to us as well, but we do target at the companies that we most want to disclose to us.
And what are some of the things that companies have to report in the forest questionnaire?
It's onerous. It's not a fun process to go through our disclosure process. So they have to answer a lot of questions, and for a big company it takes a lot of time. Often you have to get in external consultants to fill it in. So it is a big process now. But that's because we ask them on there's an organisation called the Accountability Framework, which is a group of NGOs that have come together and sort of they've identified what are the steps you need to do if you're going to eradicate deforestation from your supply chains. Our questionnaire is based around those steps. So it asks about what your governance processes are, what your targets and policies are. It asks around what sort of management processes you've got. Ask about how you deal with your supply chains. How you source certified products, all these kind of questions. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Okay, great stuff. And so CDP's got a questionnaire on forest, and your job title is Forest and Land. And what's the story there? Like, what's your kind of vision for the two of them?
So it doesn't make sense really, does it? Forest and land. It's a recognition of the ambition, so that we started out on climate, added on water and forests, but that's still only a fraction really of what we need to be monitoring. I mean, if you look at the whole environmental relationship with companies. There's many more things that are not covered by our 3 questionnaires. So we've sort of stated this ambition that we need to be asking all the relevant questions to all the relevant companies by 2025. So that involves lots of expansion. The expansion in my bit is we've been focusing just on forests. Forests are probably the key land ecosystem that we need to be focused on. But there's plenty of other natural ecosystems that arguably we should be looking at as well. And there's plenty of clearance in Latin America of the cerrado and other sort of habitat types that we should be taking into account. So it's broadening out to not just to focus on forests, but land conversion of all sorts. And then beyond that, we've got to start going towards, well, if you have land under management, if you're agricultural companies, how are you managing that? And also, what are you doing in terms of restoration and putting back and conservation projects and so on? These are all sort of ways you can interact with land that we don't capture fully at the moment. So the ambition is, at the moment we're quite sort of laser focused just on how, to what extent are you getting rid of deforestation from your supply chains. We want to broaden that question out to more understand what your relationship is with land as a whole. And then on top of that, we've got plenty of other expansion out in that we want to look more at impacts on oceans, which we don't cover at the moment. We want to look at different forms of pollution. So at the moment we just focus on greenhouse gas emissions, but we want to be looking at plastics as another form of pollution we're going to be starting to look at, potentially forms of organic pollution. So there's lots of questions that really we should be asking, but over the next few years we're going to start moving into those other areas.
And that'll be a lot of, well, I guess first reflection is that the land element is nicely aligned with the World Resources Institute, which works on the greenhouse gas protocol as a key partner, the new kind of draft guidance on the land sector removal. So nice kind of synergies looking at the whole landscape approaches. And then when you talk about all those topics, is that going to be many more different questionnaires, or what's your vision for kind of the reporting process of CDP?
So it's not all completely clear, but I think we're fairly clear that we can't keep adding independent questionnaires on. I mean, that process doesn't work anymore. For a start, it's too much repetition. So step number 1, for 2024, we're bringing together those 3 questionnaires and sort of have one questionnaire there will be separate sort of modules looking at climate and forest and water and so on. But it'll be one questionnaire you have to go through, which companies will be happy about compared to at the moment. But then into the future, the idea is that, so a lot of these issues, things like asking questions on biodiversity, we already ask a lot of the questions relevant to that. It starts getting harder to sort of separate them into nice, clear, distinct categories, because obviously these are all just sort of facets of your environmental relationship which are all interlinked. So for example, to have a strong biodiversity strategy, you would want to have no impacts on land clearance. That's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. So the forest questionnaire is already addressing that. You'd also, the third biggest impact on biodiversity is climate change. So again, your climate change performance is key to what your biodiversity performance is. So it will end up being essentially one bank of questions. Questions will be tagged to say what they're relevant to, but it might be the same question is going to answer multiple sort of issues, how you're performing on multiple issues.
I think it's something we can definitely, as Terrascope, relate to, because we work closely, like squarely in kind of the carbon space, but I mean collecting data on waste or water consumption or different things that relate to other environmental issues. So yeah, I can definitely.
It's one of the sort of areas it's really important, I think, but quite hard to explain to companies that I think most companies on the whole understand now greenhouse gas emissions, they're key. It's real. We need to get on top of it. You need to understand it. You need to disclose it. You need to manage it. The sort of momentum is already there for that. But then also there's a lot of recognition, there's some other things here as well. But then it's kind of, well, should we also be reporting on forests and water and biodiversity and plastics, and which are the key ones, and we can't do all of them. And it's about trying to explain these aren't lots of individual risks, essentially, that they're all facets of the same issue. They're all facets of your relationship with the environment. The impacts on climate is kind of one symptom of that, probably the most important symptom. But you solve for climate, you haven't solved the environmental challenge, essentially. So you've got to look at it in the round. You've got to look at it as a whole, identify all the areas that that you have your main impacts and dependencies, address all of them. It's not a case of, well, should I do this one or this one or this one? You have to look at it as a holistic sort of system.
Mm-hmm. Yes, while making it manageable. That's the challenge for companies.
Yeah.
I mean, you already get a lot of kickback, I think, from companies on the reporting. But yeah, I think it's important to always be pushing the boundaries of and understanding environmental holistically. But let's dig into the Global Forest Report. So CDP, all the forest data that's submitted to CDP by companies, CDP then analyzes, right, and kind of shares and look at the trends. This is an annual report, correct?
Yeah.
One of the things that jumped out at me reading it was really it's cheaper to fix the problem than deal with the high potential costs. And so I think the statistic was on average, because companies have to disclose or their quantified risks, and kind of per reporting company, on average there's nearly $300 million at risk. But the cost to kind of respond to those or prevent those risks is 17 million. So a high return on investment. But in your experience, are you seeing those numbers play out? Like, are companies willing to invest in, forests and preventing deforestation to avoid some of those costs?
Some yes, but in general no. And it's a really weird situation. So, as you said, we do this report every year. And one of the challenges of the report is that the conclusions are often fairly similar, and it's sort of each year, well, how are we going to tell this story in a way that is not the same as last year, but the underlying story is the same. And the story is essentially that companies are more and more recognizing that deforestation is a thing, it's a risk, and to some extent it's an opportunity. So our levels of disclosure are higher than ever. We've got over 1,000 companies disclosing to us now. We've got a good sort of proportion of the market disclosing to us on their performance. And in things like recognising risks, most of the companies are recognising, yes, we see deforestation as a risk. And then, as you say, we ask them, well, can you quantify it? Not many of them can quantify it. So it's quite a small sort of subset that give us those figures. But we ask them to quantify, well, what are the risks and what sort of financial implications are you seeing from that, and then what would be the costs of mitigating those risks? And as you say, if you aggregate it together, on average, the costs that they see coming from the risks are, I can't remember the exact figure now, it's something like 17 times higher than the costs of mitigating. And yet, as you move on through the questionnaire, so this is the sort of beginning of the questionnaire of kind of, do you recognise your risks? Have you got the processes in place to recognise them and start to respond to them? Lots and lots, increasingly companies do recognise, they do have those first, they have the policies in place, etc., etc. The story that repeats every year is that they're not acting on it, and it's not an issue unique to deforestation. This is a common thing that people make pledges, yes, we see there's an issue, yes, we'll do something about it, and it's that jump to, well, actually now we've done something about it. That's still lacking. And that stat that you highlighted, that's sort of one of the weird things, because that looks like, well, that makes it obvious that we should act on it, because it's cost much less to fix it than the risk we're exposed to. And yet still, you can't say all, but still, on the whole, companies are not acting on it, and the only reason for that can be that they've got lots of risks. They've got this repeats in lots of areas, and this just isn't high enough up the table yet. The pressure is not significant enough to make them to respond to these risks at the moment.
How do you see that play out? I mean, you've got a lot of with palm oil, right? So a specific commodity. So you've got a lot of on the ground experience. How does that, your kind of on-the-ground experience and seeing that industry change, are you seeing that tracked in the CDP report? So progress
so
on some metrics.
Palm oil is an interesting sector, and particularly because I was sort of closely involved to it in the early days, and I have seen it go through this whole journey of when it started out, huge expansion, huge sort of economic excitement around it. Big conflict with the environmental groups. The first few rounds of the RSPO, the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, you would have NGOs sitting over here and companies sitting over here, and it was all just sort of fighting. But as the years went on, they got closer, they started sitting at the same tables, everyone sort of started softening the positions, and NGOs were going, okay, we'll work with you to fix it. Companies started to being open to, okay, tell us what we need to be doing. And from being a real sort of pariah industry, I mean, it's still not brilliant, but it is one of, in terms of the sectors that disclose to us, it's one of the best performing now. And I think that is a result of both sides of that sort of argument starting to come together, see the other side's point of view, start to compromise, and really start to find solutions. And it's also a result of the kind of pressure that was put on palm oil sector, and to a certain extent still is. But that has resulted in palm oil being one of the better performing agricultural commodity sectors, in at least to us now.
And what's the pariah commodity of today?
So the biggest laggard at the moment is cattle and soy. And that's partly, I suppose, because maybe it hasn't had the same amount of attention that certainly was put on palm oil in the past, but it's also around some of the technical challenges of addressing that, which is transparency of the supply chain and how complicated those supply chains are, and particularly on the sort of cattle side, how often cattle get moved. They get moved so often during the sort of process of producing beef, and being able to have transparency and visibility across that supply chain to know where they originally came from and to what extent it was involved in deforestation is a very sort of technically hard nut to crack.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard industry to. I think there's the solutions from changing cows' diets to just very disruptive, lab-grown meat or plant alternatives to meat. And so looking at this kind of intersection of forest and climate, sometimes the climate agenda could be at odds with the forest. Generally, there's a lot of synergies, right? So tackling deforestation is a big climate solution, and more removals. There can be some climate solutions that could drive, and I think of more timber in construction material being like a kind of much better alternative from a climate perspective. Also potentially like wood chips being used in energy. So how do you think about that kind of trade-off in what you're doing, and like how do we set it up for win-win climate and forest solutions?
So certainly most of the interest in deforestation stems from interest in climate. Which sometimes frustrates me because I often like to sort of say forests are not just a carbon sponge. There's a lot more to forests than the role that they play in the carbon cycle. But as I was saying earlier, on the whole, companies are now accepting that climate is something you need to get on top of, and you can't have a strong climate strategy. Well, we're not going to meet our climate goals globally without action on forests and other nature issues. That's not going to happen. So that
even if we got rid of the fossil fuel industry today, would we be able to meet it, or we have to do better forests?
Well, so I'd say that because it's IPCC has various sort of scenarios of how we could meet those goals. I think it's right that it's almost in every scenario it involves some action on forests and nature, and that's partly because they play such a huge role in emissions. So forest specifically, deforestation is about 12% of our global emissions, and land use change in general is closer to a quarter of our emissions. So I think it's emissions from forest. If forests were a country, the emissions are above the EU. I think it's third after the US and China that comes from forests. So just in terms of addressing emissions, that's an important part of it. But obviously the flip side of forests is that they also sequester carbon. And they're one of the cheapest ways of sequestering carbon, and they're one of the best ways in that you get loads of other benefits at the same time. So, those IPCC scenarios say to meet the targets, it's very likely we have to sequester a certain amount of carbon. A large chunk of that can be achieved at sort of relatively cost-efficient, cost-effective levels through action on forests and other habitats. So they do play a really key role in in the global climate strategy. And so for any company that has any sort of implications of deforestation in their strategy, if they want a good climate strategy, they're going to have to address the deforestation parts as part of that as well. So I don't know if I've lost the thread of your original question. That certainly forests are a really important part of the climate strategy.
And the win-win solutions.
So
making sure we can.
So win-win solutions are achieving deforestation. I mean, it's for emissions are slightly tricky because most economic activities will result in some level of emissions, and it's a kind of balance of the benefits you get from it and the cost of that. Deforestation is not necessary. It's a consequence of sort of doing business just because there's been no incentive to get rid of it. But there aren't any businesses that need deforestation to happen. It's something that it's just a very obvious win-win to do is get rid of that from your supply chain. There's no benefit to having it there.
Okay, so kind of making sure if we're doing wood chips, it's not driving deforestation, just holding forests cover that we've got constant and then working with our land. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the deforestation free is really taking off. I mean, science-based targets, now you have to be deforestation free. The EU regulations, zero deforestation coming into force already, and the supply chain visibility that requires is certainly like a win-win in terms of really understanding emissions and also forest impacts. So is zero deforestation kind of like the 1.5 degree mantra in climate? Is that the forest mantra for?
Yeah, zero deforestation. I think to hit climate targets, we have to have zero conversion by 2030. But since forests are kind of the key habitat to be converted, the goal is zero deforestation by 2025. But we're not on track to achieving that. That involves huge changes in the trajectory we're on. So yeah, we're not on track for that at the moment.
Yeah, I think the pace of deforestation is still increasing, right? Or is the rate of change is still going up? Whereas at least in climate, we're not on track for 1.5, but the rate of increase we're not going down yet, but the rate of increase. But yeah, the situation is more.
So
bleak,
forest
right?
figures, it's fairly complicated because in terms of overall forest cover, so we've lost about half of our forest cover in the last 50 years, I think it is. In terms of overall forest cover, that rate of loss has dropped off. But that's largely because we have a lot of restoration and replanting in certain parts of the world. In Northern Europe, in China, in North America, there's a lot of replanting going on. So overall forest levels are looking not so bad. But a lot of that replanting is plantation forests, and it's also forests in areas where they're not sort of as ecologically productive or useful. The most important forests are in the tropics, and that's where deforestation is still stubbornly persistent. It's been around 3 to 4 million hectares a year for the last decade or so. But even there, the picture is not that simple, because there are some parts of the world where tropical deforestation is falling. And Indonesia is one of the places that's starting to get on top of that, and deforestation in Indonesia is falling. But then that gets balanced out by other parts of the world. Recently it's been Brazil where the biggest levels of deforestation have been happening for political reasons. So still on the whole, global tropical deforestation is still wavering around the same kind of level, even though in different parts of the world it's going up and it's going down.
So, but you still enjoy some corned beef in the UK, even though it comes from Brazil, driving deforestation, or you're like giving that up?
No, I've stopped eating it now.
Stopped eating it, okay.
Yeah, learned that's one of the sources of beef in the UK that comes from deforestation fronts.
Okay. Well, let's open it up and get some questions from Terrascope. So, any questions for yes?
I want to ask. Thank you. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about what it would look like if we have a deforestation-free world, right? Would it be from the demand side? Would every single company have full transparency and traceability of all the supply chain and know where the things are coming from, or that's like too not going to happen quick enough, and we need to work on the supply side where, where the commodities are coming from. There is no deforestation associated with palm oil, with soy, with beef, or like where is the sweet spot, and what would be realistic for us, to approach this?
Hard question. So I think ideally we do need to get to that point where it's fully transparent, and we kind of do have the technology that should be able to do that now, both in terms of satellite monitoring and in terms of blockchain technology and the various sort of technological tools we've got that can sort of physically do that. But you're right, we are still a long way from that, and I think it does have to be on both sides. There's going to be companies reducing the impacts on deforestation through their own supply chains, but at the same time you're going to need action by governments both to push them to do so, but also just your basic levels of protection. I mean, that's another aspect of deforestation, is that forests are not actually being protected on the ground, so you're having to rely on companies not driving it. So I think action is needed on both sides, or more action is needed on both sides.
Yeah, it definitely jumps out to me that the tropics is where the most deforestation is happening, and also the kind of most impactful, and also the hardest to trace and have that visibility on. Are you seeing kind of major breakthroughs in technology to get some of that visibility down, traced back to the farms? Or progress on how companies are doing that?
So one of the important areas that companies are not doing enough of, but when they do it is very effective, is starting to engage with their suppliers. It's one of the areas that we have very few companies really effectively engage with their suppliers, and the sort of best practice is ones that not just engage with their direct suppliers, but also further down the supply chain, and actively engage with them. So actually provide them with financial incentives or capacity building, and actually work with them to address some of the problems, rather than just saying from the top, yeah, you need to sort this out because we're getting judged for it. It's the ones that actually act through their supply chain. They're the ones that score highest with us and are getting closest to eradicating deforestation from their supply chains.
And I'll open it up again, but how are Asian corporates doing in the disclosures?
They're not doing too badly. I mean, the laggards geographically are North America. The leaders are Europe, and Asia and Latin America are sort of in between. There are areas where Asian companies are doing well, so around demonstrating legality, also having policies, the right sort of policies and governance in place. Asian companies tend to be good at that side of things, but not so good on the actual management and sort of result side of things. So very few commodities produced by Asian companies can be said to be definitely deforestation free, for example. And there's also very little engagement with suppliers happening in Asia. I think it was sort of around 1%. It was very low. And the last area is there's not so much engagement with landscape approaches, although that's not so much just Asia. That's fairly common actually, is that we need more engagement on that. But the figures were certainly fairly low for Asia, and that's one of the areas where sort of landscape approaches are definitely a really effective way of addressing deforestation.
Which region is doing well on the supplier engagement and, I guess, kind of financial incentive side that I guess Asian corporates could be looking to?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember particularly. I think it's more particular examples of companies doing it, and companies that will actually, and I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head any particular examples, but there are some where they will actually sort of give preferential rates if you meet some certain criteria, or they'll provide financial incentives or actual capacity building. That's your sort of gold standard level of what you should be doing with your suppliers.
Mm-hmm. And then this landscape jurisdictional approach, paint a picture for us what that looks like.
Well, so this is, it came from, companies have been committing getting rid of deforestation from their supply chains for quite a long time now. Sort of some of these commitments were over 10 years, and companies, although they're actually genuinely trying hard, really still struggling to do it. And part of it is because even if you do the right things, if you're one company in the landscape, deforestation can still be happening, and sort of your actions kind of get lost in the soup of it all. So landscape approaches is just means starting to coordinate your action. It could be either with your peers in your sector that are operating in the same sort of area, or it could be cross-sector as well. Ideally, it's also in collaboration with the government and with local communities as well. If everybody in an area is on the same page and says, right, we're all going to be doing the same things, companies are often the ones that have to bring the finance, government really need to be doing the coordination. And that's when you can start really seeing action on deforestation, is when everybody starts working in coordination like that.
And you're seeing some governments receptive to...
Yeah. There are examples of this springing up all over the world, and we're seeing much more engagement by companies as well. So although it's still only a few hundred that are doing it, we've been asking the question for the last 2 years now. This is the third year we're asking the question, and each year we've seen massive jumps in the numbers of companies that are engaging in it. And one of the projects actually that we're involved in is sort of taking some of these examples of landscape approaches and trying to identify, what good looks like, where are the good examples, where do you need to look for inspiration, and also trying to address some of the challenges of how do you get finance flowing to these, and how do you scale up these ideas and get them to start happening across the world.
I'm already thinking, how do we get an emissions factor for a jurisdictional approach that's modeling zero deforestation, right? But any other questions for Tom around forests? Yeah.
With the rapid adoption for AI and EV batteries, mining for rare earth materials or minerals has really picked up and will be tied with economical growth for some time to come. How do you think such companies will be able to, get A's for grades in the CDP Forest Climate Report?
Most of our focus is on agricultural commodities. Agricultural commodities are the biggest drivers of deforestation. But having said that, mining is definitely another driver of deforestation. And in fact, in a way, it slightly goes under the radar, because usually the kind of final conversion of land is to an agricultural commodity, and so that kind of gets the blame, if you like. But often the steps that happened before that were a mining company would come in and maybe have a relatively small footprint themselves, but they build the roads in, they bring in the people to work in the mines, and those are the sort of first steps that then turn into agricultural conversion. So mining actually plays a very key role in those sort of first steps of the deforestation issue. So yeah, that is certainly a big issue, and that balance between needing those new minerals for renewable energy is a big challenge. What was your question? How to solve that, basically?
Or just like how they can track it better, or for example, like palm oil, right? Like they were trying to find ways to improve their emissions, like trying to lower it. All these things. How can mining companies maybe play their role as well? So
they certainly can. We're slightly going outside what I do at CDP, but it so happens that this is the issue I used to work on before CDP, so I can speak a little bit about it. And there has been a lot of focus on recognizing that mining has to happen, and it's going to have to happen more, as you say, for some of these particular minerals that we're going to particularly need, minerals and metals. And there are ways of doing mining in a way that has a much lower forestry impact. And the World Bank has been supporting sort of quite a lot of work in this area. So there are things like you can do underground mining, actually, is one of the sort of more extreme versions of where you minimise the impacts on top. But probably the biggest sort of impacts are the impact of a mine is not so much the footprint itself, even though when you see some of these mines, you look at things like the Freeport mine in Indonesia, it's enormous, and you think, well, that's a terrible impact on forest. The actual footprint of the mine is still relatively small in the bigger picture of things. The main impact they have is the drawing in of people, and then the sort of resultant conversion that happens. So it's addressing these sort of secondary impacts is where mines can have a really big impact. And the way they do that, because that's an area they kind of step back from and go, well, that's not our responsibility. But mines are often such a massive part of the economy, particularly in poorer parts of the world, that they actually have huge sway in what happens. They have huge sway but also power to support local government and so on. So they need to be using that power to make sure these secondary impacts of a mine are not happening.
Great. And Ginny, we had a mic question.
I think with regards to the questionnaire, what do you think are the main questions that companies have more challenge in addressing and disclosing as well?
I think the ones about suppliers and further down the supply chain, because companies haven't been traditionally thinking about that too much. I think those are some of the hard data to get. Not quite answering your question, but the thing that sort of jumps to mind is as we move forward and as we start looking more at sort of wider impacts on nature, and there's a sort of new framework out called the TNFD, which is outlining how you sort of measure these impacts. There you have to start having information about your local impacts, about your local facilities, what the state of nature is in those areas. Those are going to be questions that they're going to really struggle with, because that's not data that companies would traditionally hold. So I think coming up, they're going to be the hardest questions to answer. We don't ask many questions around that area yet, but we will have to moving forward. I can't think of the top of my head which other ones are jumping out. I probably will as soon as we finish this conversation.
Yeah, generally a lot of quantification. So kind of as we wrap up, and I guess any other questions? Yes, 2 more online. Okay. Forest topic is a hit with the company. That's great.
This is a question from Parinita, which says, how can we save or rebuild the biodiversity of our forests?
How can we save or
Rebuild.
Well, stopping deforestation is the main thing you can do. So the main drivers of deforestation loss that IPBES, which is the sort of global equivalent of the of the IPCC, so the sort of highest scientific authority on biodiversity. They've identified 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss. Number 1 is land conversion, of which deforestation is the kind of most significant part. So address that, you've addressed the biggest driver of deforestation loss. Then the other factors you need to address, climate is another key one. I think number 2 was direct sort of exploitation, so that's direct hunting, it's particularly relevant in sort of fishing and so on. So direct exploitation of species is number 2. Number 3 is climate change and other forms of pollution as well. And then the last one is around invasive species, the fact that we accidentally move species around the world and they have various impacts. But so the quickest way to address it, I'd say, address deforestation and other habitat loss. That's do that and address climate change. We're going to be a long way to fixing it.
So I have a related question to that. I mean, while overall at a deforestation level we can quantify and say about 12% is what contributes to sort of climate, is there a deep, maybe there isn't, really not aware, at either say a species or a microhabitat level that says this is what this habitat or this species or this particular type of forest is contributing towards, and therefore it is that much more important to save?
So are you saying, is there a way of quantifying the kind of value of the different types of habitat? Well, so the general rule is the closer it is to the tropics, the closer it is to the equator, the more the more services we get from it. Let's put it that way. People do put values on what we get from biodiversity and environment, and they're often very big numbers. But I'm always very wary of doing that, because they're always minimum estimates, because they're basically the bits that you can actually work out a financial value for. How you put values on some of the services we get from nature, such as the fact that it generates the oxygen we breathe and the fresh water we drink, you can't really put numbers on those. But I suppose the general answer to your question is, in general, the closer you get to the tropics, the more biodiversity there is. The more biodiversity there is, the more the wider range of services that get generated, the more resilient they are to change, the more adaptable they are to change. So that's why the tropics tend to be the most valuable and most important areas for biodiversity.
Thank you. So last question online. It's from Ellie, and I'm reading it out again. It says, I'd like to hear more about the deforestation of Brazil. I noticed rosewood has been endangered for a long time, almost 10 years. Could you please elaborate more on the Brazil situation? How is the outlook?
For rosewood, I'm afraid I have no idea, so I can't answer that bit. And in fact, I don't have much more of an idea on Brazil, except that it's a direct consequence of Bolsonaro's policies. And you saw it really, really clearly. Hopefully now that the rhetoric around that has changed a lot, and we'll just have to wait and see if the results happen. But it is quite interesting seeing what an effect. We're often sort of looking at who can do what on deforestation. A lot of our focus is on the role of the private sector, but just looking at the impact of a change in political leadership on deforestation levels shows how important government and policy are. What they do is absolutely crucial. It guides what companies do and what communities do, and it was a rather depressing example of how influential politicians can be.
And I guess the importance of the private sector advocating for and putting the weight behind good policies for optimal outcomes. So just thinking about, there's a common quote that probably everyone knows, but the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is now. I think in your case, it would be the best time to have not cut down a tree, right? So we're preventing deforestation. What was the thing that you wish we had done 20 years ago that we're doing, that you're actually seeing happening today?
I don't know if there's a single thing. I mean, it is a little bit frustrating how we only focus on one issue, and I think we've wasted quite a bit of time, because over the time I've seen biodiversity was the focus for a while, and before that we had the ozone layer and we had acid rain, and it's always seen as separate issues, and we kind of almost, you try and fix one thing and then it's almost you have to do the whole thing over again. And if only we could have started from the beginning of seeing things more holistically, and rather than kind of putting sticking plasters over the symptoms, actually addressing the underlying illness, if you like, which is our misbalance between the imbalance of our relationship with the environment. If we could have done that much earlier, that would have been very important. But I suppose the other thing with deforestation that's a little bit depressing is that on climate, in theory, it's reversible. I mean, you stick stuff into the atmosphere, you can suck it back out again. We're not really doing it, but in theory, it's possible. Deforestation's not, and certainly loss of nature is not really reversible. And once you start having extinctions and when you get to that sort of level, then there's no going back. So I think that's something that really needs to be recognised as well, is that this isn't something we can really play with and then fix later. Deforestation we need to achieve. We can't not achieve it, because there'll be no going back.
Okay, I want to end on that's a realistic check, I think. It's definitely scary with things like that keeping you up at night. What is it that you're working on at the moment? What are some of the projects and plans that you have for with CDP or kind of more broadly?
So the work we're doing on landscape approaches it happens to be one of the reasons I'm in this region at the moment, and so that's one of the important areas, because I've been visiting what we've been doing in Indonesia there, and that's bringing together provincial and district heads, but also bringing them together with companies who are all interested in sort of, well, let's work together on this. And what they're specifically doing there is they're looking at the different projects that maybe are being supported by governments or by companies in an area, and starting to develop pitch books, basically put them all together and make a sort of a proposal to investors that sort of package this all up. And because one of the problems is that these individual projects aren't getting funded because they're too small or they're not described in a way that appeals to investors. And so we're trying to sort of build those links to start getting, because there is money available to invest in these kind of things, and you speak to investors who say, well, we can't find projects that are investable, and you're on the ground, you've got projects, and they go, but no one's paying for this, and it's about sort of trying to make those links. So I'm hopeful, having spoken to both sides, knowing that the supply and the demand is there, you've just got to link them. That's one of the areas I'm hoping is going to have some positive impacts, and also just the story in Indonesia, which as a country that I've been based in for a long time and has often been quite depressing news, Indonesia is one of the places that is getting on top of its deforestation, and it's not necessarily the first place you'd have expected to have achieved it, because it's very difficult and it was very bad, but they are getting on top of it. And so again, that's another the positive signs I'm seeing moving forward.
Okay, great. So there are spots of hope. That's a tropical environment that's going to have a big impact, right, on our kind of forest and climate agenda. So yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Thank you for everyone for the great questions. And yeah, really great to have you, be hosting you
Thanks for having me.
in Singapore. Thanks.
Thanks.
Awesome.